From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Ted Widmer, the director of the John W. Kluge Center, and I'm about to ask you to turn off your cell phones, but I just remembered I need to do it myself, so I'm going to take care of that. And then I want to say what a huge pleasure it is to introduce Wayne Wiegand, our speaker today. I'm relatively new to the library, as all of you know, and it's been such a pleasure to begin to learn the history of the Library of Congress and to think about libraries in this country and in our world. I had been in the library about 1 hour on my orientation day when John Cole, who's with us today, gave his history for all incoming employees, and I listened rapt with fascination, and I've been trying to read about the library, our library, in my not very ample free time, but I feel lucky a second time because Wayne Wiegand has been here for a lot of my time here, and the work he's doing in relationship to the history of libraries in this country could not be more topical or more timely. I won't preempt his talk to you today, but I just want to say he's really taking a historical topic and bringing it in a very relevant way to ongoing social concerns. And if he won't tell you in his talk today, I want to mention that he's giving a talk on April 25th in Richmond, Virginia at the James Branch Cable Library entitled "Open These Hallowed Doors, the Desegregation of Public Libraries in the American South." And I believe that's his next book project. Is that right, Wayne? But he's here today to talk to you about the history of school librarianship in our country. His talk is entitled, "How Long, O Lord, Do We Roam in the Wilderness? A History of School Librarianship." He is the F. William Summers Emeritus Professor of Library and Information Studies and Professor of American Studies with a PhD from Southern Illinois University in 1974, with numerous scholarly publications in both history of libraries and American studies. His books include Books on Trial, Red Scare in the Heartland, which came out in 2007, with the University of Oklahoma Press, co-authored with Shirley A. Wiegand, and named Book of the Month Club for November 2007. And in addition to Books on Trial, he has authored over 70 scholarly articles and many publications relevant to the history of text technologies, including History of a Hoax, Edmund Lester Pearson, John Cotton Dana, and the Old Librarian's Almanac, Politics of an Emerging Profession, the American Library Association, 1876 to 1917, An Active Instrument for Propaganda, American Public Libraries during World War I, again very timely, and Irrepressible Reformer, a biography of Melville K. Dewey. I added the K because I remember that initial because I once saw it spelled out, and it was, I believe, Kossuth. He was named after the Hungarian freedom fighter, Lajos Kossuth. I forgot to mention he's at the University of Florida in Tallahassee, and he also has served on the faculty of the School of Library and Information Studies at University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he co-founded and served as co-director of the Center for the History of Print Culture in Modern America. I could read many more of his accomplishments, but I think I would cut into his time, and you all came here to hear him. So without further ado, please welcome Wayne Wiegand.
Should I predecease her, I've left my wife specific instructions about what to do with my remains. I told her, cremate me, take my ashes, hide it in a book, and donate it to the Library of Congress so I can spend it with my friends in perpetuity. I've decided to modify those instructions. I'm going to ask her to divide my ashes in two, half going into a book into the Library of Congress, the other half going into a book to be donated to the John W. Kluge Center because I've had so much fun here the past several months. Thank you, Ted. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, Travis. Thank you, Callie. Who am I missing? Mary Lou. Thank you all. Do look for the book after you read my obituary, okay? People love school libraries for a whole bunch of reasons. Some are obvious. In her autobiography, Speaking Truth to Power, Anita Hill remembers a seating system her grade school teachers crafted to reward achievement, gradually moving high-achieving students who finished their assignments early from seats located on an inner schoolroom wall to seats located on an outer wall where, under the windows, teachers had placed the schoolroom library. After finishing her assignments ahead of her fourth grade classmates, Hill recalled, she loved the freedom to simply reach out and pull whatever I wanted from the shelf without leaving my seat or drawing attention to my idleness. She specifically mentions encyclopedias, geography, and history books, and Nancy Drew mysteries she and her friends frequently shared. Her recollection reflects a thirst for information, a love of libraries, and the voluntary reading they enable. Some reasons people love school libraries are not so obvious, however. In response to an exam question about library as place for a course I taught at the University of Wisconsin-Madison years ago, one student wrote that in the mid-1980s, his high school librarian was being pressured to remove titles about homosexuality from the shelves. At the time, he was a sophomore struggling with his own sexual identity, and he wanted and needed those books. Then something unusual happened. Title by title, the librarian reported the books lost, thus satisfying parents and school superiors protesting their presence in the collection. But, my student reported, somehow he and his gay friends soon discovered these lost books had actually been misshelved behind others in a remote part of the library. There they could access the books freely, and all understood that any book taken from the collection, which need not be checked out since they were officially lost, had to be returned to the same place. The collection was still there, intact, and including a few newer donated titles the day he graduated. Now, school library history is full of anecdotes like this, and I could recount a number of them over the course of my remarks this afternoon, but what I really want to do is to get at the essence of school librarianship so you understand the world of control under which it operates. Let me explain my title. How long, O Lord, do we roam in the wilderness? It's a biblical passage, and it was the title of an article by Marilyn Miller, who taught me when I was in library school back in the 1970s. She was a fairly well-known figure in American librarianship, particularly school librarianship. And she was one of those referred to as the Grand Dames, or the Grand Dames, a group of women who took hold of the world of school librarianship early in the 20th century and literally crafted the contours of school library practice. Her title comes from her frustration. She had just gone through the Great Society programs when the Elementary and Secondary Education Act had provided millions of dollars to school libraries that literally doubled their number across the country and quadrupled their collections. That's one of the measures libraries use to indicate impact and growth. But as the Nixon administration withdrew funds from the Elementary and Secondary Act titles, she noticed that there wasn't a replacement of that money with local funds. She was also frustrated with the fact that the American Library Association, the major professional association that governs, it functions as the nation's national library voice, was not very friendly to one of its divisions in which she was operating, the American Association of School Librarians. And at the time, they were actually contemplating leaving the American Library Association, perhaps joining with some division in the National Education Association. So she was frustrated, and that's why I take it as my title, because I want to address the issue of where does school librarianship fit. Now, when it comes to theories, I happen to be promiscuous. I will consort with any theorist I think will give me a framework that helps me explain what I'm finding historically. As a youth, I went through my providential period, and then, of course, as an undergraduate in any University of Wisconsin institution in the 1960s, I had my Marxist period. My wife often refers to that as my red period. But what I find most comfortable with this particular project is the concept of discourse. What do I mean by discourse? Most scholars trace the concept to French philosopher Michel Foucault, and as Wikipedia explains, humanities and social science scholars in particular harness this concept to describe not only a culture's formal way of thinking that can be expressed through language, but also a social boundary that defines what can be said about a specific topic. I took that concept of discourse, added to it the word professional in order to define what I perceive to be a professional discourse, which functions like a big intellectual sandbox. Plenty of room to play with ideas, but one nonetheless that has limits, a social boundary, if you will, in which leaders employ a formal way of thinking to educate and enlighten members of a profession who implements what they learn to improve service for the public's greater benefit. For school libraries, that translates into the services they institute and maintain, the collections, spaces, and resources that they make accessible. The roots of contemporary school library discourse trace back to Benjamin Franklin, whose first order of books for the new Library of Congress, a Library Company of Philadelphia in 1732, emphasized useful knowledge. That's a term that comes directly out of the Enlightenment. Useful knowledge, but ignored fiction. By the time the American colonies declared their independence in 1776, Western nations were rapidly industrializing under capitalism. Unlike the rural counterparts, industrial workers found their day divided not by sunrise and sunset, and their year not by seasons, but by a clock their employers used to determine when work occurred. To capitalists, work time was always more important than non-work time, which evolved its own set of descriptors, including leisure or recreation. Capitalists consistently privileged useful knowledge generated to improve work above any information considered leisure. School libraries, serving the information interests of formal education, naturally mirrored these priorities. Western states operating within capitalist economies also privileged work information, but to that added public information and stories the state regarded so essential to the social order that they constituted a canon of relevant literature, fiction and nonfiction, to be communicated to citizens and taught in schools and colleges. School libraries, serving state interests, also collected and preserved these kinds of public information and stories. But they performed these tasks within a set of discursive formations. What are these discursive formations? Well, I'm going to show you the portrait of a person who has probably had more influence on your life than you realize. That's Melville Dewey, crafter of the Dewey Decimal Classification. 95% of school libraries, as well as public libraries, use the Dewey Decimal Classification. As a matter of fact, in the late 1890s, he was a competitor for the position of Librarian of Congress, and I'm thinking the only reason he didn't accept it if it was offered to him was because he had a private club in upstate New York that he wanted to develop, and he was only going to spend 9 months of the year working here. At any rate, you can be sure that if Melville Dewey had been Librarian of Congress, the collection here would have been Dewey Decimal Classification Scheme. Now, Dewey was a student at Amherst College from 1870 to 1874, and so he went through the Amherst curriculum. He became acquainted with Amherst teachers. In 1873, he took a job, part-time job, to help out with his finances in the college library, and loved what he saw. But he thought this library was not well organized, so how to best organize it? He shopped around for other classification systems and fell upon a system that was developed at the St. Louis Public School Library by William Torrey Harris, who later became Commissioner of Education for the United States. Harris had built his scheme on two sources. One, ideas of Sir Francis Bacon, who had argued that the three faculties of the human mind, memory, imagination, and reason, produce three categories of learning: history, poetry, and philosophy, each of which could be further subdivided. And two, the ideas of G.F.W. Hegel, who inverted Bacon's order to give a more prominent role to philosophy, and from which the rest of the structure follows. From philosophy, the science containing all sciences, Harris saw a natural structure of knowledge progressing to theology, the science of the absolute, government, philology, nature, including mathematics, physics, chemistry, and the natural sciences, the useful and the fine arts, and finally, geography, biography, and history. That Dewey largely tapped Harris's structure as the broad blueprint for his own decimal scheme. In order, they are philosophy, theology, sociology, philology, natural science, useful arts, fine arts, literature, and history, is hardly debatable, but in defining and identifying the hierarchy of divisions and sections he created beyond that structure, Dewey looked elsewhere for guidance, and particularly to the Amherst College faculty, the courses he took, and the textbooks he had. So I passed out a copy of the Dewey Decimal Classification Scheme in its broad way, and I'm going to show you how he picked up things from his textbook. If you look at 137, which is labeled, 130, which is labeled on the 23rd edition of the Dewey Decimal Classification, Parapsychology and Occultism. For him, this was known as temperaments, okay, temperaments, which, and he subdivided the temperaments based on a theory he got out of his textbook that somehow human emotions were determined by body fluids. And so what particular body fluids were flowing around in your body determined what kind of temperament you had, and that was cemented into the 137 section of the Dewey Decimal Classification Scheme when he came to the Library of Congress, which was in the Senate building at the time, in 1876 to copyright his scheme. Now, that scheme very well reflects the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant patriarchal culture in which he existed. And why do we have 23 editions of the Dewey Decimal Classification Scheme? Because it's been a constant effort to address the biases and prejudices built into that scheme. For decades now, I have been trying to encourage scholars to do a social history of the Dewey Decimal Classification Scheme. All one has to do is look at, for example, how W.E.B. Du Bois's book, Souls of Black Folk, has been treated over the course of those 23 editions to see some element. I also have a paragraph here on Native Americans. Vestiges of systemic racism continue to plague most Western cultural institutions. Libraries are simply institutions that tell a story, said Winnebago tribal member and Huntington Park, California public librarian Michael McLaughlin in a 2005 Native American Times article. It is the community that decides what that story is and how it is told. To McLaughlin, it was clear librarianship's practices placed Native Americans at a distinct advantage in the story. Libraries told about them. For example, neither the Library of Congress nor the Dewey Decimal Classification adequately addresses the histories and contemporary realities of American Indians. Neither had a category for tribal sovereignty that enjoyed equal status with other systems of government. Similarly, while Picasso and Monet were classified as art, Indian sand paintings, pottery, and basketry were classified as crafts and primitive art. And while Protestantism and Catholicism found comfortable niches in religion, Indian spiritualism was found in mythology, folklore, and other religion. In short, McLaughlin concluded, every American Indian perspective, accomplishment, or cultural belief, practice, or material product, according to these classification systems, is of a subordinate or inferior nature. So the Dewey Decimal Classification, one footing in this set of discursive formations I'm describing, has built into it a momentum, an inertia, which resists change. And I would ask each of you, first of all, how many of you have had public school library experiences as a child, young adult? Okay? A number of you. And my guess is how you receive my remarks will be conditioned by the experiences that you had in those school libraries. Ask yourself, if you were first exposed in school to the Dewey Decimal Classification system, is that how you perceive the organization of knowledge at this point? How much influence has that had on your subsequent life? Now, let me move to this one. And this photo is going to stay up for a while. What you see here is Dewey in the middle of his first class of library school students at Columbia College in 1887. There's a story here. Dewey became librarian at Columbia College in 1883, and he always wanted to start a library school. So he began organizing it, began soliciting subscriptions, began encouraging people to apply in the fall of 1886. What he didn't tell his superiors was that he was going to admit women to this school on the all-male campus. Once the Board of Overseers found out, they refused to allow him to use school facilities. So what he did instead was went across the street from campus and opened up his school in a storeroom above the chapel. This is a picture of the individuals there. Now, notice the gender composition. Dewey's a male, a couple of males on the left side, but the rest happened to be females. And they all knew they were there under unique circumstances. It really wasn't a certified school within the Columbia system. I call it a bootleg school. But here is where I think most of the professional discursive formations that we in librarianship operate under today took root. And let me explain how that works. First of all, because Dewey could not determine, he could not allow his students to take courses elsewhere, he tapped into a set of Saturday morning public lectures that Columbia faculty were expected to deliver. In the fall of 1886, he asked those lecturers to deliver lectures on the best books and scholarship that was emerging from their fields. You may recall between 1870 and 1900 was when most of the professional associations to which many of you now belong emerged. American Historical Association, American Political Science Association, American Sociological Association, American Economics Association, each of which established a journal in which reviews were a major part of that activity. So what Dewey asked his students to do, females could attend Saturday morning public lectures, was go to specific lectures and take notes. So they would find out what was the best literature in each of these individual fields. Where's the locus of authority? it's not the library student nor the librarian determining what is the best book or article in the literature. It is the professional in that particular discipline doing so. So those library school students learned very early, that's how you determine what is the best literature. You look to the professional experts outside librarianship. That was one component of their curriculum. Another component, Dewey brought in a number of library luminaries to inculcate what has become known as the library faith or the library spirit. That word pops up a lot in library literature and still pops up on occasion, as those of you who read it regularly can attest. It's built on a Jeffersonian concept. In order for democracy to function properly, it needs an informed citizenry, Thomas Jefferson said. And librarians simply extended it. In order to be an informed citizenry, libraries are essential to democracy. Makes a great deal of sense. Added to that, particularly at this time, comes Andrew Carnegie donating his millions of dollars for nearly 1,700 public library buildings across the country. And that whole Jeffersonian principle, public library, library faith, got juiced with a whole lot of growth all at once, late 19th, early 20th century. About the same time, John Dewey is positing his progressive theory of education, which is looking not at kids as adults to be waited for, but as children who have central concern. Okay, so you have first the Dewey Decimal Classification as one element in this discursive formation. You've got the curriculum where the indirect authority of librarianship is practiced by external experts. Then you've got the library faith, and to that then Dewey actually added a core. First, teach cataloging and classification, including subject headings. Subject headings do carry the same kinds of biases and prejudices and privileges that the decimal classification scheme does. To that, add management. How do you manage a school, a library at this point? There wasn't a whole lot of literature on that, so a lot of internship kind of activities took place. But always, the angle was how to, because you already had the justification for why coming out of the library faith. Now, I want to also note here in the management of the library, Dewey happened to have started an organization called the Library Bureau in 1881. And the Library Bureau, I'm willing to guess, there's probably Library Bureau furniture scattered hither and yon about the Library of Congress, if I'm not mistaken. It's that beautiful quarter-sawn oak that is so sturdy, under which generations of wads of gum have been stuck for decades. At any rate, if you think about a library room, there's a central command post. It's built into the circulation desk, and you have a person staffing that desk. Well, having told you about this particular picture and the gender composition of that picture, you can well imagine that the likelihood of the person occupying that desk is going to be female. And because she must staff that desk, and there are users, clients all around her, should some upheaval occur in a remote corner of the library, she cannot leave her command post, which was built into the architecture of the library. So what does she do? Shh. You see the beginning of the stereotype of Marian the librarian emerging from the very architecture and the furnishings of the library. Another one besides management is reference. That's kind of gone out of hand. We're not calling it reference so much anymore. The direct line from reference in the late 19th century to 2017, we now call it information literacy. And finally, bibliography. it was very important for the library school students, these people you see here, to learn bibliography. And if you look at the emergence of the printed works of the late 19th, early 20th century, you see these discursive formations in evidence everywhere. Let's just go back to reference. You remember Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature, those of you over the age of 25? Now, the same kind of biases, prejudices that manifest themselves in the classification schemes also manifest themselves in Reader's Guide to Periodical Literature, which never indexed a periodical like the Chicago Defender that went to 250,000 African Americans. Nor did it ever index Colored American, which went to about equally as many. So for an individual who wanted to look up a topic on African Americans in the 1930s, go to his school library and get their abridged Reader's Guide, two of the major organs of communication aren't being indexed there. If it's not indexed, librarians are not inclined to purchase them because there's no bibliographic access to them. Or a series of bibliographies. When the Chicago World's Fair started in 1893, ALA had a huge booth, and they had a new publication called the Catalog of ALA Library. It identified 5,000 books recommended for any beginning library, and that was important because that's when Carnegie was starting to give out his money, and they needed instant collections. What Dewey had his students do was comb the reviews of the American Historical Review, the American Economics Review, etc., all those periodicals being put out by the professional disciplines for the best works, mark them and include them in catalog of ALA library. This became a tradition, and out of it came in the early 20th century children's catalog, which recommended the best books for children. Of course, didn't include any Horatio Alger, or subsequently Nancy Drew, or subsequently Goosebumps. In essence, catalogs like children's catalog cemented a particular set of literary canons into existence, and quinquennially these books would pop up at school libraries. School librarians would then take them to their card catalog, and the materials in the children's catalog they did not have were marked for potential acquisitions. The materials in the children's catalog that were not in the materials that were not in the children's catalog were marked for what we call weeding in librarianship. So over the years, these bibliographies became very powerful, and they include bibliographies like the elementary school library catalog, the junior high school library catalog, the senior high school library catalog, which had a tendency, in part, to homogenize collections nationwide. So another discursive formation. What makes school librarianship unique, however, is that the women you see here seized upon a vacuum of authority for children's literature. In the late 19th century, as John Dewey's progressive theory of education took root, the world of children's publishing began to emerge and grow significantly. No one was ready to take that on in terms of evaluation, and so public school and school librarians seized it as their locus of authority. Now, all of the I have to say all, well, I'll say nearly all of the individuals who were part of that group looked like these people here. White, middle class, females, who were educated in particular ways to like particular kinds of literature. They evolved a set of canons that those bibliographies reinforced that looked askance at what the popular literature of the day was. And all of those books tended to celebrate the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant patriarchal culture. Come the 1950s, 1960s, and I'm just going to stick with this world of children's literature right now. Come the 1950s, 1960s, and the feminist movement and the civil rights movement, a woman named Nancy Larrick began to look at these literatures and say, hey, wait a minute, I don't see any black faces in children's literatures. They're not getting an analysis of how black kids live, and black kids aren't getting an analysis of how black kids live. She went back to the school library and said, hey, wait a minute. The females who are depicted in this literature are generally in subordinate positions to males. The active ones are males, the passive ones are females. So having come to know that, the school library people began to recognize that they had cemented into existence in their literature collections the very biases that they wanted to fight against. I don't think they ever said, you know, we made a mistake. And come the 1980s, post-Stonewall, there began to be a recognition of differences in sexuality. So those are the three footings of the discursive formations of school librarianship discourse. But I'm going to add a fourth one, and that is the commitment to intellectual freedom and opposition to censorship that finds its rhetoric in what's called the Library Bill of Rights. The Library Bill of Rights was passed by American Library Association in 1939. The word race is included in it. And it came as a result of observations of the Nazi Party burning Jewish books in Nazi Germany, Grapes of Wrath being banned in schools and libraries across the country, 1939, 1940, and Chinese librarians saying, please help us after the Japanese had conquered China in the 1930s and began burning their libraries. So the Library Bill of Rights. To it, the school librarians in the early 1950s added the School Library Bill of Rights, which modifies it for particular school librarianship. But the Library Bill of Rights, even though it sounds like it's got the force of law, has no teeth. If anyone in this room chooses to challenge a book in the local school library and is a powerful figure in local politics, the librarian has two choices: potentially lose her job or fight you. If the librarian chooses to fight you, no one will come to her aid to pay for the legal expenses required to do so. So the Library Bill of Rights, though it sounds good and is part of the library rhetoric, doesn't have teeth to it. Publicity helps, of course, but once again, the locus of authority is elsewhere. Just like what are best books is allocated to others, the locus of authority in the school library resides with the school system. Could be the principal, could be the superintendent, could be very vocal members of the public who bring their issues to attention. So these are the constraints under which school librarians have operated since the late 19th century. School librarianship itself is largely a 20th century phenomenon. It wasn't until compulsory education made more and more people come to school, until high schools became commonplace, that school librarianship took root. And for every generation of school librarianship, it has been females who have been the leaders. They were the ones who established a section within the American Library Association early in the 20th century that later became a division of the American Library Association in post-World War II era, that then threatened to leave the American Library Association because the leaders didn't think that they were operating properly. So how long do we roam in the wilderness? I would argue that's your home, the wilderness, because you're caught between the world of librarianship with its discursive formations and the world of education, where the real power is. In order for school librarians to be participants in the practice of librarianship, in practice of education, they're the ones who have to go to the education community and tell them, hey, it's working out just fine. We can contribute to the educational process. That's one of the things I found out while I was here. But let me just finish with, that's not all there needs to be. There is no holy book in which God says what a library should be. A library is what people make of it. Now, 2 years ago, I published this book, Part of Our Lives, A People's History of the American Public Library, for which I thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for the fellowship that allowed me to do it. In that book, I discovered by listening to the voices of the people who used public libraries that they use it for three main reasons. A, information access. And in librarianship, we're all about information access. I'm not disparaging that at all. B, the library as a place, more than a third place, as Ray Oldenburg would describe it. It's a place where community gets constructed in a whole bunch of different ways, through a whole bunch of different forums, through the space it provides. And C, through the social nature of reading. We often think of reading as a solitary act, and it's not. It combines us with other people. And I think, let me just give you some. Recent research in neuroscientific research has demonstrated how narrative in fiction activates particular parts of the brain, including the sensory and motor cortexes. In her summary of this research, Anne Murphy-Paul notes, the brain, it seems, does not make much of a distinction between reading about an experience and encountering it in real life. In each case, the same neurological regions are stimulated. One researcher, she reports, found that fiction offered readers the opportunity to enter fully into other people's thoughts and feelings. Another saw substantial overlap in the brain networks used to understand stories and the networks used to navigate interactions with other individuals, in particular, interactions in which we're trying to figure out the thoughts and feelings of others. Other researchers suggest reading fiction is an exercise that hones our real-life social skills, and that regular fiction readers seem to be better able to understand other people, empathize with them, see the world from their perspective. Fiction, notes Keith Oatley, is a particularly useful simulation because negotiating the social world effectively is extremely tricky, requiring us to weigh up myriad interacting instances of cause and effect. Just as computer simulations can help us get to grips with complex scientific problems, so novels, stories, and dramas can help us understand the complexities of social life. Do you all remember what the Dewey Decimal Classification System does with fiction? It ignores it. Fiction has been the bastard stepchild of library collections for 150 years. But let me give you two experiences of reading fiction, particularly popular fiction. After her father died in 1963, 9-year-old Sonia Sotomayor buried herself in reading at her Bronx library and the apartment she shared with her mother and her brother. Nancy Drew had a powerful hold on my imagination, she remembered. Every night when I finished reading and got into bed and closed my eyes, I'd continue the story with me in Nancy's shoes until I fell asleep. Her mind, she noted, worked in ways very similar to Nancy's. I was a keen observer and listener. I picked up on clues. I figured things out logically, and I enjoyed puzzles. I loved the clear, focused feeling that came when I concentrated on solving a problem and everything else faded out. Every single female Supreme Court member read Nancy Drew as a kid. Nancy Drew never shows up in the bibliographies of school library collections. Last example. In 1984, President Ronald Reagan wrote the daughter-in-law of Harold Bell Wright, whose best-selling 1920s religious novel, That Printer of Udell's, Reagan read as an adolescent in Dixon, Illinois. Shortly after reading the book, he declared himself saved and was baptized. The novel's protagonist, Reagan wrote Wright's daughter-in-law 60 years later, served as a role model that shaped his life. It's likely that copy of that printer of Udell's Reagan Red came from the Dixon Public Library, which he visited twice weekly in the early 1920s, often reading on the library's front steps. So, you've got the discourse of school librarianship. It's a sandbox, intellectual sandbox, in which you can play with a whole lot of stuff, but it's got boundaries. And I would argue, if you look towards the social nature of reading, if you look towards the library as place and don't be bound by the discourse of school librarianship, history would suggest there are some opportunities out there to be seized. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions. Whoops, excuse me. Oh, one thing, I'm almost knocked here. While here, I have been checking the obituaries of the grand dames and every generation of female leaders of the school library profession. And I am absolutely struck with how many of them are lesbian. I think women who shared this evangelical belief in what libraries could do, who were same-sex, found a comfortable place to practice librarianship, to practice a profession. Now, I need more information. I need to interview individuals who are my age, because Marilyn Miller was one of those individuals, the one who wrote, "How long, O Lord, do we roam in the wilderness?" And I need to interview more to see if indeed that the number of what were called Boston marriages at the time, the number of Boston marriages exceeds the norm for the population at large. Okay, so. Yes?
That there was excuse me. Hi, thank you. You had said that a researcher had said that the brain does not make a distinction between a fictional narrative and real life. Who was the person who said that?
What you can do is email me and I'll send you the site.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I took this from a New York Times Sunday morning paper article, and this Annie Paul Murphy cited several scholars who were working on social neuroscience reading. And that's what I have to give you. I can't remember. Keith Oatley is the name that comes particularly to mind, but there were others. There are a number of these research experiments going on around the country. We live in an age where the education profession is being pressed towards testing and measurement. In that kind of an environment, school libraries don't prosper very well. So the discoveries by social neuroscientific scientists may not directly apply to the current situation unless we come up with enough funding to restore. I live now in the state of California, where the state has made a decision that schools don't have to employ school librarians. So if school libraries exist, they're usually held open by volunteer parents. Dan?
You made a number of comments about how the classification system tends to solidify a particular sort of intellectual bias, and that may change over time. But I don't think you've addressed the question of, is that a good or bad thing? And if it's a bad thing, is there some way of dealing with that and eliminating the bias?
It's an inevitable thing. No, there is. All you can do is keep paying attention. At least that's what history tells me. 23 editions of the Dewey Decimal Classification Scheme. I think the Library of Congress subject headings identified homosexuality as a sexual perversion up until the middle of the 1970s. And so pressure's brought to bear and changes occur. This summer, thanks to the National Endowment for the Humanities, which gave me a summer stipend, thank you very much, I will be going to the University of Illinois, where one of Dewey's best students went. Huge library system that still uses the Dewey Decimal Classification Scheme. It's too expensive to change. They can't possibly do it. So that's built into the inertia to change.
I had a question about, you suggested several times about the marginalization of fiction in school libraries, but I was a school librarian here in DC for 7 years, and I would suggest it's not the library that is marginalizing fiction, it is the educational curriculum.
Sure.
And their desire always to have children only reading nonfiction.
I'm not going to debate with you. My youngest son and his wife are well-heeled. They own a $4 million home on top of a hill in suburban San Francisco. And across the street is the public school to which my grandson goes. Shortly before, last time I was visiting home, they held a fundraiser for the library, which is Jay Gatsby kind of thing. Pictures of my son in Jay Gatsby uniform, pictures of my daughter-in-law in whatever she wore, Jay Gatsby's Zelda. Yeah, okay, all right. So anyhow, they raised $100,000 that evening for the school library. That library is going to have that fiction because it's well supported. So you're right. Where education, and that's the locus of authority for the school library. It's what the curriculum dictates. Most of the states have bibliographies that they send out to school libraries from which school librarians select materials. I don't know if your state did. California does. They still do it. So that already restricts the universe of possibilities in some respects, unless you can get extra money to buy the materials you want. Now, my grandson's school is radically different from the school located in downtown Oakland, to which poor kids. The school library in one is significantly different than the school library in the other. So it's tied to funding, too. Yes? Oh, sorry, Brenda, just a second.
Sorry.
I think you need to get the microphone first. Yeah.
Sorry.
Thank you very much for this fascinating lecture. I have three short intertwined questions. The first follows on the question of fiction and its place in the Dewey Decimal System. You mentioned that it has been ignored over the course of 23 editions. And I was curious what the relationship of fiction to literature may have been, because there's an 800 class titled Literature. And I've always been interested in the tacit separation of fiction and literature in some bookstore layouts, for instance. Would be interested in knowing how this plays out in library classification. Related question has to do with...
Can I answer one at a time?
Yeah, sure.
I'm old
Sure.
now, and I may forget the first one you asked.
Sure.
When you open the New York Times book review this Sunday morning, I'm willing to bet a month's Social Security check that you're going to see the words serious reading 4 or 5 times.
Right.
You know where that started? In the early 19th century, when the publishing industry began to recognize that women were were becoming increasingly literate, and that they wanted a particular kind of fiction, the publishing industry began to supply it. And largely they were romances. Well, in the male-dominated reviewing media, they would review these materials and they'd call it mere reading, M-E-R-E. Whereas opposed to the other kind of reading was serious reading. Now, that phrase has come down to us to the present day, and it has baggage, obviously. So what you see addressed in the 800s is what cultural leaders regard as serious reading.
That's very helpful. It's amazing how that term mere reading bestializes women.
Well, the journey towards today includes mind candy, trash.
Right.
Okay? And it all fits into that, you know, recreational reading just isn't as important as useful knowledge or information that computers can manipulate. I'm not disparaging that, mind you. It's just,
No,
and Sonia Sotomayor, she found Nancy Drew compelling.
Right, which testifies the importance of fiction, yeah. So the related question had to do with the classification of languages and literatures that are essentially outside the pale of the West, broadly speaking, as other languages, other literatures, and what you had to say about how classification centralizes certain forms, or centers certain forms of knowledge and marginalizes and implicitly subordinates others. So I was curious about that as well, because the architecture of libraries sometimes mimics this kind of architecture of classification. Even here at the Library of Congress, you have the main reading room where a certain vision of the West is centered, and then the other rooms are satellites, and often the architecture of those rooms reflects, you know, a kind of pantheon also of Western thinkers. So you go into the African Middle Eastern studies, African Middle Eastern reading room, and you look up and you see, you know, Darwin and you know, Mozart and Bacon and so forth.
If I may interrupt. And if you
it.
look at the school library walls of the 1930s in Birmingham, Alabama, you've got Robert E. Lee. If you look at the school library walls in Madison, Wisconsin, at the same time, you got Abraham Lincoln.
That's fascinating.
The walls
That's really
demonstrate the cultural priorities of the locality. So I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No,
That was a
that's quite all
teachable
right.
moment, and I thought I'd seize it. So.
We have time for one more.
Brenda's got to get a question here. She came all the way from Alexandria, Virginia.
Oh, Wayne, in the course of your research, what did you discover about the ways in which and the degree to which municipal funding played a part in the operation of school libraries?
Yeah, school libraries depend almost entirely on local funding. It's like 95%. The only time that there was a significant change was in those war on poverty programs coming out of the Johnson era. And that's when they just literally doubled in number and quadrupled in collections. And there was a whole bunch of money available for other media kinds of things. But it's directly tied to local funding. You live in a poor district, you're generally going to have poor school libraries. You live in a wealthy district, you're generally going to have good school libraries, staffed by professionals who ask questions and participate in the instruction. Am I done now?
I want to just invite you all to a talk next week at the same time. Timothy Breen, who is another senior chair here at the Kluge Center, will be talking on new interpretations of the American Revolution. So please join me in thanking Wayne Wiegand for his talk today.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.